Doesn't always look the same, Sometimes he doesn't have eyes. Sometimes he's got two mouths. Sometimes he hits like a bolt from the blue, like being hit by a grenade. Other times he's slow and inevitable, like a turning gear with bones in it. The teeth, though, plus his food are always the same. Goes after addicts, hence the name. Needles. Jeremy Juice Martins woke up on the wrong side of a bed he didn't recognize, in a crack house he didn't remember. He rose bolt upright in an erratic lurch, the fringes of a half-remembered nightmare still tingling down his spine. The fear intermingled with the cold sweat already pouring from his hairline and brow, though that was nothing new. He remembered black eyes and a bear-trap mouth shutting on his ribs, and the smell of rotten meat, and the moon. He was jarred back into the moment by the shouting of someone over him, and simply stared vacantly up at a piece of the deep city trash that was screaming at him. It was still too early in the day for him to make out any words through the slug of syllables tumbling from the frail woman, and resorted to lip reading. He had finally managed to put together that she was saying something about an overdose, with her pale, withered hands swatted him so hard across the face they rolled off the piss-stained mattress they had been inhabiting. By the time he had stopped flailing like a freshly born deer calf and had found his 6-inch survival knife along the 3 jackets he wore, the woman had already scurried from the room, like some kind of crack house smack fairy. Slowly rising to his feet, knife in hand, and arms splayed for balance, he finally took a moment to survey his surroundings. There were at least 17 other bodies in what could have been a living room of what used to be a decent one-story ranch. From the smell, 3 or more people had soiled themselves and twice that had thrown up. There was another smell underneath all that, a kind of stale smell, like the smell of a wet dog crawling out from an algae-filled lake. Though his nose prickled with this hair-raising stench of the drug house he found himself in, that smell bothered him even more for some reason. It seemed familiar, and yet alien for where he was. Before he could make any progress in locating the scent, the smack fairy came back with 2 men, and another woman being carried by the wrists and ankles by other druggies. The smack fairy shoved Juice to the side, screaming out kinds of profanity through broken teeth, the color of rich caramel, and dreadlocks so over-bleached that I thought one might break off as it bounced on top of her constantly twitching head. The junkies had the other woman down on the recently vacated twin mattress, and standing above her, dumbfounded as she thrashed and seized and foamed. "Yep, time to quit this place," was Juice's only thought as the froth turned bloody, indicating that the seizure had already had its way with her tongue and teeth. He offered the friendliest platitude he could give while backing toward the door amongst the slowly walking horde of junkies, now rising to witness the events, or rolling to the other side. "Make sure you keep her head turned so she doesn't puke," he muttered feebly. "Fuck you, Juice," the smack fairy shot back, tearing up at the sight of her thrashing friend. "Why don't you just swallow that knife?" And with that, Juice was gone, with the ever-useful information that apparently the slap fairy had gotten his name out of him at some point during his binge. I just hope they haven't had sex, given that it looked like she hadn't even been eating for one. He sure as hell didn't have any desire for a kid. The second piece of information he gained was that it was nighttime, and this particular drug house was on the side out town within an industrial complex, if the smog floating past was a nearby street. Light meant anything. Once again, he detected the wet dog and algae scent, but this time shook it off. He needed food, water, and enough money for a bus to come back to the city proper. At least, there he could find a small parking lot stairwell in which to hole up. A quick check of his clothing had shown a distinct lack of wallet. Now that being said, it would be a mistake just to assume that Juice was a homeless man. As a matter of fact, there was a 3-story house with his name up on the lease into Bellevue Heights, and all he had to do was trade in his tourniquet for a rehab token, and his ever-loving wife would give him back his house key and lift the restraining order. Fucking bitch, he muttered, stowing the knife in the folds of one of his 3 jackets and shouldering the cold. On his way down the road, he smirked at a motorcycle under a tarp of the driveway of a house, a lawn that someone had clearly taken care of not to have infested with the city's disenfranchised masses, and indeed had done so through the use of regular watering and a mower. The knowing smirk faded when he noticed the oil stain in the driveway beneath it. What that meant to Juice was that whatever person lived in that house was not currently donating to his habits. 6 years ago, Juice had designed a part for preventing oil leakage in mid-grade street bikes. That was simple for any very seasoned mechanic to install, for a hearty sum of course. While telling his wife what it did during the design phase, he referred to the oil as bike juice. In a moment of hyperfocus and Adderall-inspired brain fog. In doing so, he earned his nickname that he'd gone by ever since her joyous, ringing laugh. Happier times those were, before or perhaps between the heroin fog that had taken up residence in his life since then. Ha-Yeon and him, sipping wine on the back porch, while he did his best to explain how the inner workings of engines and are attempting to describe painting techniques. He had wanted to save both of his vices and his wife, but she had started avoiding him once he picked up the habit again. She had looked even disgusted when he told her he wanted her to take a hit with him, which he had thought was a romantic gesture. She cried the whole day. She provided him with the ultimatum to get out and get clean or wait for the cops. She kissed him on the way out the door and squeezed his hand when she told him about the restraining order. She still had the phone when she left with him. She even checked in every now and then. A cold wind blew an empty bag of chips against Juice's leg, rousing him from his memories. He cleared his throat and attempted to spit out the building blocks that he had just settled in his throat. Something came out and spattered onto the cement, some gelatinous blob that spoke to the ravages upon his body. As he considered the blob, Juice thought about getting clean for the first time in a long time. Just then, a shadow flitted from behind him from the angled orange light of a slowly falling street light on the other side of the street, causing Juice to whip around so fast his head almost didn't stop with the rest of him, and he almost continued his live-action Bambi rendition he had started in the drug house. By the time he got to his feet, to find places on the ground that would keep him vertical, he surveyed the abandoned suburban road again, then stared up at the streetlight. A tree limb from the particularly dead pine tree in the corner that had just been about like it had been reaching out to capture the light, but the limb hadn't been long enough to intersect with the light. The failing and grime-encrusted streetlight hurt his eyes and twisted his gut thanks to the come-down he was currently undergoing, but he still watched the branch waving ever so slightly in the wind. His head waded through the frazzled muck trying to puzzle out the wrongness of the branch's form, slowly reconciling his thoughts into something useful. The branch splayed out toward the end, into 5 protrusions that ended in points, and was fairly thin, not too much thicker than his own wrist, throughout. Then 2 things struck him. For one, as the branch rhythmically bounced up and down, that point just before the branch splayed out and twisted down at the bottom, that snapped upward at the apex of the movement. 2, the air had not moved an inch since he stopped walking. That left the idea of it waving in the wind reduced to just waving. The realization that it was being greeted by an entirely inanimate piece of nature was initially funny enough to Juice that he rose a hand to wave back, until it occurred to him that it implied. And with that cold moment of realization, he snapped his gaze back to the street, not wishing to know anymore. Easier to pass it off as an effect of his chemically abused brain, but his averted gaze did not help his situation, as a shadow on the ground slowly materialized as a single conical shape, coming from the right and stopping at the center of the light. It was slow, deliberate, and it came with a sound like glass underfoot. On top of this, the snow was back with a vengeance, and so thick this time that it evoked in his mind the image of a golden retriever drowning in a pond 2 inches thick with surface scum. Then, with a pop and crackle, the light was gone, and Juice was away, running like a buck with 6 tranquilizers sticking out of his hindquarters. To the mind of Juice, he was traveling at supersonic speeds down the old neighborhood roads, but in all actuality his speed was barely above that of a tall man power walking. And behind him, he could swear he could hear footsteps that matched exactly. He took to running to light post, and brief stroke of genius born of the idea that he would not need to look behind him so long as he could use the ebbing and flowing shadow of himself and his pursuer. But as the long shadows stretched out to envelop his own, he quickly realized the error in this method. He did not know how to tell how close it was. Despite his pathetic pace, he did in fact seem to be getting further away. Either he had slowly gained superhuman levels of speed, or somehow the lanky terror behind him was somehow slower than even him. Then, as he approached the next light, his pursuer had vanished altogether. In a moment of panic, Juice swung his body around to look at the suburban road behind him. As he did, his ankle rolled below him, and Juice spilled onto the ground. Through the flares of pain, he frantically grabbed at his injured ankle and shot furtive glances in every direction, still choking on the ever-present stench of pond scum. Every horror movie that he had ever seen flashed through his mind, and he stared directly up at the street light above him. Empty space, occupied by only a flitting series of moths obsessed with pelting themselves against the glass. Taking the respite to catch his breath, Juice tested his ankle and found it could support him through running, maybe out of the question. Which wasn't too great a loss, because he was fairly certain the London tour bus and its traffic might still be a better contender for outrunning the beast. As his adrenaline faded, something new caught his attention, a kind of warm wetness trickling down his leg. It did not surprise Juice to find he was bleeding. What did surprise him was the knife sticking out into his side. The only thought that slid through the muck of his withdrawal-riddled brain was one question. Why didn't it hurt? Then it did. Juice howled into the air and fumbled for the handle, wriggling the knife slightly out of him, which shot a new lance of pain through his body. Vague thoughts of shouting for help shot through his mind, but when he tried, he immediately choked on thick air, decaying vegetation, and dead animals still hanging in the air. Tears of pain dropped from his eyes as he simply pressed apart his jacket against the side of the blade, and he sank to his knees, barely able to breathe. In an attempt to regain control of himself, he closed his eyes and forced air into them, fighting against the urges to cough, sob, and scream. It occurred to him that keeping a knife shoved in the pocket of a loose-hanging jacket, rather than some kind of sheath, may not have been entirely safe. Something hard brushed along his cheek, eventually smearing a tear across his face, a sweet gesture, but in the context of helping a thoroughly stabbed homeless man, wholly inappropriate. As Juice opened his eyes to now look at the mysterious wiper of tears. As Juice opened his eyes to look at the mysterious wiper of tears, he could not have agreed more. The monster was back now. and now with him under the streetlight. The thing was smiling a smile that looked more like a bloody gash all the way across the lower part of its otherwise humanoid face, filled by an uncountable amount of 6-inch needle, rusting teeth. Instead of looking up into eyes, he found himself staring into vague indents where eyes should be. It was as though someone had bleached a rotting carcass white, skinned it, then stretched that skin over into his skull as tight as they could. Juice assumed that the skin was white, but under the bottom line street light, hideously pocked skin of the beast looked like tobacco-stained leather. His eyes moved just slightly, getting the full picture of the creature, and as he did, it seemed that the comparison to a skin-wrapped skeleton continued to be true. While still humanoid in structure, bones jutted out from every direction from the shoulder blades to the hip bones. Seeing the talons on his feet, Juice had just enough time to notice that the creature had digitigrade legs before his mind remembered that thing was what caused him to fall in the first place. He snapped back to reality and whined out a cry, wrenching backward as the creature's hand flipped to reveal his palm, and the index finger curled upward in a sudden jerk. The wicked claw whistled through the air and sliced Juice through the nose, cleaving straight through the middle between the nostrils. Juice shrieked in renewed and sharpened agony and started to propel himself away. His ankle gave immediately, and he just fell onto it again on his front, jerking the knife in its unwanted socket. Overcome by his own suffering for just a moment, Juice began to lurch away from the beast, passing a chunk of cartilage that just might have been once part of his nose. At first, the beast seemed content to watch him with his void face and jagged mouth. Juice flailed onward, setting his eyes to better horizons. To his shock, he found a person just ahead, smoking a cigarette underneath the next light, and took a swig from a brown glass bottle and leaned against the pole, seeming to watch Juice make progress toward him. He called out then, through the choking smell, as he noticed clawed hands fall on either side of his head as the creature crawled all over his crumpled form. The man walked a little closer, voiding his shape into a silhouette as he drew closer and put the light behind him. The beast settled on Juice's behind and snapped down, raking its teeth through Juice's hair. A chunk of his scalp dragged free through his skull and into the thing's mouth as the man dropped down to one knee and said the final words that Juice would ever hear. Just what the fuck am I supposed to do? And just like that, Juice was shredded, peeled, sliced to scraps before the two street lights that would be ruled as some kind of animal. He shrieked as a claw rose up his spine, slicing 3 vertebrae before it snapped and ripped the next one upward and free, and the creature dug its face, biting through its back into his large intestine. It bit twice and scratched his belly button from the wrong side, and bit a 3rd time to eat that too. Juice grabbed for the man who would not be his savior, and the man grabbed back. He wrapped his fingers around Juice's and held firm, shushing him gently, but the man did not lie and say it would be over quickly as the beast brought his foot up as it forced its head further into Juice's body and patted its leg like a pleased puppy. His claws stripped skin from muscle, then muscle from bone on Juice's flailing leg. His eyes went dark on the image of the man holding his mouth, chugging the rest of his beer with a cigarette hanging out of the corner of his mouth, and did not have the withdrawal to be impressed as a blood shot forth from his nose and mouth. Some time later, the monster stood tall above the stain and shrieked its euphoria into the sky. Its moment was ended by the sound of one cold one being cracked, and looked down to the man who had held hands with its prey until that too had been taken. "Feel better, Needles?" The creature settled down onto its haunches and grinned, leaning its face into the stranger's. "Then let's go home."